This used to be a fishing trawler. For 30 years, the tide has come in twice a day, and twice a day it has tried to pull her under. The mud has crept up her hull a little more every year. Right now, nearly a third of this boat is buried, not sitting on the seabed, but inside it. The seafloor has slowly grown around her like scar tissue. Most people who saw her assumed she was already gone. A few locals even forgot she was a boat at all, just a strange shape in the mud you see at low tide. We didn't think that was good enough. So today we're asking a question nobody's asked in 3 decades. Can this trawler float again? Or has the mud already won? We first heard about her from a local fisherman who's worked these waters his entire life. He mentioned her almost in passing, the old wreck out past the channel marker, like it was just a feature of the landscape, not something that used to have an engine and a crew and a name painted on the bow. That's usually our first sign that something's worth a closer look. When a boat becomes scenery instead of a vessel, it usually means everyone gave up on it a long time ago, which also usually means nobody's tried to save it. We waited for a low-tide spring window, the only time you can actually walk out to her without a boat or a death wish, and made the trek across half a mile of tidal flat. The first thing that hits you is the angle. She's leaning nearly 20 degrees to port, locked into the mud at a tilt that no boat is supposed to sit at. The hull color is barely visible under decades of rust bloom and algae staining, streaked black and orange like the steel itself is bruised. The bow is the worst of it. It's sunk nearly 4 feet into the mudflat, swallowed almost up to the old anchor point. You can see the waterline rings from countless tides, layer after layer, like growth rings on a tree, except every ring represents another 6 hours where the sea tried to claim a little more of her. Walking around her for the first time, we noticed something that made this project different from anything we'd done before. This wasn't a boat sitting in shallow water that we could pump out and float free. The mud wasn't just underneath her. It was around her, inside compartments, possibly inside the hull itself, if there's been any breach at all over 30 years. How does a working fishing trawler end up abandoned in a tidal flat for 3 decades? And is there any version of saving a boat that's this deep into the ground it's standing on? That's what we needed to find out before we committed a single resource to this project. The local fishing community had fragments of the story, but nobody had the whole picture. So we started piecing it together from harbor records, old newspaper archives, and conversations with people who remembered her working. She was a coastal fishing trawler, built for inshore work rather than deep ocean trips, the kind of vessel that would go out for a few days at a time chasing whatever was running that season. Steel-hulled, mid-sized, built sometime in the mid-20th century based on her riveted construction style, which tells us she predates the welded hulls that became standard later on. She worked for decades under at least 2 different owners before her final season. According to harbor records, her registration lapsed just over 30 years ago, around the same time the local fishing fleet went through a brutal contraction. Quota changes, falling fish stocks, and rising fuel costs put a lot of small operators out of business almost overnight. We talked to one retired fisherman who remembered her specifically. He said her owners simply couldn't make the numbers work anymore, sold off what gear he could, and the boat got moved to a mooring in the inlet, just until he figured out what to do with her. He never figured it out. The mooring eventually failed, decades of neglect and weather wearing through whatever line was holding her, and the tide did the rest, walking her slowly into the flat until she settled and never moved again. Once she stopped moving, nature did what nature does. The mudflat is a living system, constantly depositing sediment with every tide cycle. A stationary object becomes a collection point. Silt builds up around the hull first, then climbs the sides, then starts filling in low points. 30 years of that process doesn't just surround a boat. It actively buries it. This explained the central problem of the entire project. We weren't dealing with rust and rot alone, the usual restoration villains. We were dealing with sediment load, possibly thousands of pounds of compacted mud and silt that had become structurally part of the site she was sitting in. Before touching a single tool, we needed an engineer's opinion on whether the hull could even take being moved at all after 3 decades of that kind of stress, asymmetrical settling, tidal cycling, corrosion at the waterline repeating twice daily for 30 years. The marine engineer we brought in was blunt early on. The biggest risk wasn't the visible rust. It was what we couldn't see. How much of the hull plating below the mud line had thinned from 30 years of being intermittently submerged in brackish, oxygen-rich tidal water, which corrodes steel far faster than full-time submersion or full-time dry storage. We needed to know what we were dealing with before promising anyone a comeback story. Step 1. Assessment before extraction. We couldn't dig this boat out blind. The first real work wasn't restoration at all, it was investigation. We brought in a small team to probe the mud line at multiple points along the hull, checking plate thickness with an ultrasonic gauge anywhere we could get a clean reading through the corrosion. The results were mixed. The upper hull, the parts that had spent 30 years mostly above the highest tide line, were in rough but workable shape. The sections at and below the historical waterline were significantly thinner, as expected, with a few spots dangerously close to failure. That gave us our plan. This wasn't going to be a tow her out and see what happens job. It needed staged extraction, with structural support added before she ever left the mud that, frankly, had been the only thing holding some of her shape together for years. Step 2. Building support before digging. We started by hand-digging trenches alongside the hull rather than using heavy equipment, which would have risked destabilizing the surrounding mud and potentially causing a sudden shift or collapse. This was slow, physical, unglamorous work, shovel by shovel, often standing in ankle-deep water during the work windows between tides. As we exposed sections of the hull, we immediately began shoring it up with timber supports and inflatable lift bags, designed to take weight off compromised plating before it had to bear any load on its own. Step 3. Dealing with the bow. The bow was the most deeply buried and the most structurally uncertain section. We worked in narrow tidal windows, sometimes only 90 minutes at a time before the water came back in, slowly excavating around the stem and forefoot. About 2 weeks into excavation, we hit our first major setback. A section of hull plating near the turn of the bilge, an area we hadn't been able to fully inspect from the outside, gave way slightly under its own weight once partially unburied. Not a catastrophic failure, but enough to tell us the hull was more fragile in that section than our earlier readings suggested. That meant pausing extraction entirely on that side, while we fabricated a temporary external doubler plate, essentially a steel patch bolted over the weak section to spread load and prevent further deformation, buying us time to plan a permanent repair later. Step 4. The float test. Before attempting to move her at all, we needed confidence that the hull could hold water out, not just hold its shape. We sealed what we could, patched the worst breaches with temporary marine epoxy and steel patches, and waited for a tide high enough to partially surround the hull without fully submerging the deck. This was the moment that told us whether 30 years in the mud had been a death sentence or just a very long pause. Step 5. The lift. Once we had confidence in the patched sections, we used a combination of the inflatable lift bags and a controlled cable winch system anchored to solid ground beyond the mudflat, working the hull free in small, careful increments rather than one dramatic pull. Rushing this stage risked tearing the hull apart at exactly the corroded sections we'd worked so hard to reinforce. It took nearly 4 hours of millimeter-by-millimeter movement, watching for any sign of new stress or cracking, before she broke free of the suction that had held her in place for 3 decades. The setback that almost ended the project. As we got her onto a transport cradle for the move to dry dock, we discovered the stern tube and rudder assembly were almost completely fused with corrosion and marine growth, effectively seized solid. This wasn't something we could fix in the field. It meant the engine and drivetrain restoration, which we'd hoped to tackle immediately, had to wait for specialist machine work most small yards aren't equipped to handle. We won't pretend that moment didn't sting. After getting her out of the mud, finding out the drivetrain might be a write-off was a gut punch. Step 6. Hull repair and dry dock. With her finally on solid ground, the real restoration could begin. We cut out and replaced every section of plating that had thinned beyond safe limits, working frame by frame, replacing rivets with modern welded patches below the waterline where strength mattered most, while preserving the original riveted construction wherever the steel was still sound, to keep her character intact. Step 7. Addressing the drivetrain. The seized stern tube eventually came free after extensive penetrating treatment and mechanical work, though the propeller shaft showed enough where that we made the call to have it precision machined rather than risk failure once she was back in the water doing the one thing she's built to do. The day we floated her in a controlled test basin for the first time, nobody on our crew said much. We just watched the waterline. She sat level. No list. No water finding its way in anywhere it shouldn't. 30 years buried in mud that should have killed her by every reasonable expectation. And she floated like she'd never stopped. We're not going to pretend this story is finished. There's engine work ahead, deck work, wiring, all the unglamorous tasks that turn a floating hull back into a working vessel. But the question that mattered most, the one everyone who'd given up on her had already answered with silence, has its answer now. She can float again. The mudflat didn't win.